Hello out there. We're on the air. It's hockey night tonight. If you're going to do a podcast about Toronto, it's only a matter of time until hockey comes up. However, we're going to try to do something a little bit different. This episode and the next will be about the history of hockey in Toronto before the Leafs arrived on the scene. There are a gajillion different books about the Leafs, and we don't have anything to add. So instead, we're going to talk about hockey before Conn Smythe bought the team and they became the Toronto Maple Leafs. I'm Adam Weiser.
And I'm Grayson Miller. And this is Muddy York.
Now, if we're going to talk about hockey history, we need to acknowledge something from the start. Montreal was the birthplace of organized hockey in Canada. I take no joy in saying that, but it's true. Hockey historians generally agree that the first organized hockey game was played in Montreal in 1875. Now, earlier, I asked Gray when he thought the first organized hockey game took place in Toronto. I didn't expect him to know the answer, but he did. So why don't you explain how you knew this particular bit of trivia?
Well, I used to have friends that would go to the Granite Club. I know it sounds pretty bougie, but I did. The Granite Club is a private club in Toronto. It used to be located downtown, but moved up into the Bayview area in about the 70s. The Granite Club was known, and I think it was my friend's dad that told me, or there was a plaque in there or something, but there was a team called the Toronto Granites, and according to this local historian, aka my friend's dad, the first hockey game in Toronto was played there. Was that right?
It was? In what year was it played?
I think 1888 or something like that.
Until then, hockey was almost unknown in Toronto. During winter, Torontonians of that period participated in sports like skating, snowshoeing, tobogganing, ice yachting, which was apparently a thing, boxing, fencing, shooting, indoor baseball, and curling. The only references to hockey from Toronto were newspaper articles about games in Montreal. That first Toronto game seems to have been inspired by a visit from Tom Patton, a goalie from Montreal and one of the early stars. After learning that Torontonians were oblivious to the new sport, he ordered 18 new hockey sticks from Montreal and organized some practices for his colleagues.
Toronto's first official hockey game was held on February 16th, 1888, when the Granite Curling Club defeated the Caledonian Curling Club 4-1. According to a report in the Globe, the play was very exciting and the sport is sure to become popular. This would be the beginning of a distinguished history for the Granites. If you go to our website, you can see a picture of the Granite Hockey Club from 1892, just 4 years after they had played their historic first game. 36 years later, in 1924, the Toronto Granites would win gold at the first Winter Olympics in Chamonix, France. The Caledonian Curling Club quickly disappeared from the scene, but they left an important legacy. The game was played at their home rink in the Garden District, just east of St. Michael. The Mutual Street Rink, as it was commonly known, would be the premier venue for Toronto hockey for the next 20 years.
But despite this first game, hockey was still just a novelty. The real breakthrough would come in 1890, when the Rideau Rebels hockey team visited the city. The Rideau Rebels were named for Rideau Hall, home of the Governor General. Do you want to guess the name of the Governor General at that time?
Would that be someone named Stanley?
Yes, it would. Frederick Arthur Stanley, 16th Earl of Derby, better known to us as Lord Stanley of Preston. Now, Stanley appreciated hockey, but his kids were obsessed. After witnessing several matches at the Montreal Winter Festival, they created their own team, the Rideau Rebels. The name was a bit ironic because every player was a member of the British establishment. When the Rebels announced that they would visit Toronto to play matches against a pair of local sports clubs, it caused a huge stir. The team arrived on the Governor General's private railway car and the players were feted by Toronto society. The games were played before a large and very fashionable audience, who took great interest in the game, applauding the good play of the visitors and the local men alike. The Rebels won their first match against the Granites, but lost the next day against the St. Georges. But the game results were irrelevant. Toronto was obsessed with the monarchy, and now hockey had received an endorsement from the Queen's official representative in Canada. All of Toronto wanted to be part of this fashionable new game.
So it seems like in the early days of hockey, it was just various social groups that played other social groups in the city?
That's exactly what it was. Different groups had different teams and played in different leagues. There was the Toronto Church Boys Brigade Hockey League, the Toronto Bank Hockey League, the Toronto Lacrosse Hockey League, founded by lacrosse teams to stay in shape during the off-season.
Interesting, the Lacrosse Hockey League. Okay. So hockey at this time was very different from the sport we know today. For one thing, it was always played on natural ice. Artificial ice did exist, but the equipment to make it was very expensive, and most people thought that Canadian winters made it unnecessary. This meant that if Toronto had a warm spell, games had to be canceled, or the players wound up playing on the slushy ice surface covered in water. Teams played with 7 men at a time instead of the 5 plus the goalie we know today. Players were expected to stay on the ice for the full 60 minutes and no substitutions were allowed. However, the most obvious difference to a modern hockey fan would be the forward passes weren't allowed. Players had to stick handle the wear past their opponents and shoot the puck down the ice and chase after it. Later, in 1890, Lord Stanley's son organized a meeting in Toronto to manage hockey in Ontario. He also convinced his father to become the patron of a new Ontario Hockey Association, aka the OHA. I also played in the OHA at one time. In its first season, the OHA included 12 clubs, 3 from Ottawa, 2 from Kingston, 1 from Lindsay, and 6 from Toronto. These were actual clubs, groups of people who met to participate in an activity, not like the NHL clubs of today. They included university clubs like Queen's, military clubs like the Toronto New Fort Team, and private clubs like the Toronto St. Georges. Ottawa had a head start when it came to playing hockey, and the team that would become the original Senators won the first 3 championships. But in 1894, Ottawa quit after complaining that the OHA was favoring teams from Toronto. Even back then, Ottawa always complained about Toronto hockey teams. That year, Toronto won its first hockey championship when Osgoode Hall defeated Queen's University in a 1-game final for the OHA title.
All of these were amateur teams. At first, this was because no one was willing to pay to watch them play. But as game crowds started to grow, arenas began charging admission for spectators. Still, the OHA insisted that only amateur teams could compete. During the 19th century, the idea took hold that sport should only be played for the love of the game. Amateur sport taught virtues like endurance, courage, and self-sacrifice. Professional sports were seen as morally corrupt. There was a strong class element to this distinction. Upper-class gentlemen, as they were called in those days, could afford to pay out of pocket for training and equipment. They could also afford to take time off for road games. Working-class players couldn't. Toronto hockey authorities were obsessive about punishing any sign of professionalism. Remember, this was Toronto the good, moral, upright, and more than a little bit Puritan. You were considered a professional if you took money. You were a professional if one of your teammates took money. You were even a professional if one of your opponents took money. Once you had been branded as a professional, you could never play amateur sports ever again. The OHA declared that suspected players would be considered guilty unless they could prove that they hadn't been paid. Obviously, this didn't stop the development of professional hockey, but it led to something called shamateurism. Clubs wouldn't directly pay athletes to play for their team. Instead, one of the club members would arrange for a well-paying job that didn't require too much work and left plenty of time for practices and games. People also started to notice that players would often be suspended for professionalism just before games against teams from the Toronto establishment.
So far, we haven't mentioned the biggest hockey prize of all, The Stanley Cup was first awarded in 1893. Over the next 8 years, most of the winning teams were from Montreal, and Toronto wanted to match this traditional rival. At this time, the NHL didn't exist, and the Stanley Cup was a Challenge Cup.
So what's the Challenge Cup?
Well, it's like a boxing title. A team held the title until they were defeated. There were numerous leagues all over Canada, and league champions were allowed to challenge for the Stanley Cup. The cup-winning team got to keep the trophy until they lost their league title or were defeated by a challenger from another league. In January 1902, the Toronto Wellingtons became the first Toronto team to compete for the Stanley Cup when they won the OHA title and challenged the Winnipeg Victorias to a best-of-3 series. There was huge interest in this series, and live game reports were sent by telegraph from Winnipeg. But Toronto fans would be disappointed as the Wellingtons lost both games. There were a couple of technical hiccups during the series. In one case, the puck got lodged in the rafters and the players had to throw their sticks to try to dislodge it. In another case, the Wellingtons scored a goal with half the puck after it had split in two during the play. Finally, during a break in play, a dog ran onto the ice, possibly seeking an autograph from one of the players. He was quickly pursued by his owner a moment later.
The next Stanley Cup challenge came 3 years later, when the Toronto Marlboros lost to the Ottawa Silver Seven. Toronto papers complained about dirty plays by Ottawa, saying that the Marlboros were unaccustomed to the style of play that permits downright brutality, cross-checking in the face and neck, tripping, hacking, slashing over the head, and boarding an opponent with an attempt to do harm. Ottawa papers responded that Toronto was just outplayed and said that the Marlboros looked like a bunch of old women chasing a hen. Incidentally, the Marlboros junior team would eventually become a farm team for the Leafs, better known to us as the Marlies. The Marlboros were gearing up for another Cup challenge the following season when it was reported that 3 of the Marlboros had played for the professional Temiskaming League. All 3 players were eventually banned from amateur hockey. At almost the same time, the Stanley Cup champion Montreal Wanderers declared themselves professionals. Because anyone who played against professionals was also considered a professional, it meant that no amateur Toronto team could challenge for the Cup. The OHA claimed that it has not cared who won the Stanley Cup or any of the cups that are a detriment to the games they were expected to promote. The OHA looks with indifference on the battles for the Stanley Cup. This was a bald-faced lie, and everyone knew it. But the bigger problem was that Toronto hockey fans still cared about the Stanley Cup. And if amateur teams weren't going to compete for it, they would have to find a professional team that would.
Alexander Milne would become the mover behind Toronto's first professional hockey team. He had been manager of the Wellingtons. Now, he was manager of the Mutual Street Rink, and he decided that a professional team would be a great way to fill the seats. He also realized that the 3 Marlboros banned by the OHA would be the perfect foundation for a team. Bruce Ridpath was the most important of these players. Riddy, as he was known, was a Toronto native who had come up through the junior ranks. He was also a champion canoe racer at a time when that was a big deal. In Toronto, he was a star on par with Austin Matthews. The Toronto Professionals, as they would become to be called, only played exhibition games during their first season. For the 1907-08 season, they joined the Ontario Professional Hockey League, made up of teams from Guelph, Brantford, and Kitchener. What would it be like to watch a Toronto Professionals hockey game at Mutual Street Rink? Well, as we already mentioned, it was an unheated natural ice rink, so you would have been cold. It also would have been a lot darker. The lighting at your local arena is about 5 times brighter than the lighting for one of those games. Following the puck would also have been a lot harder because the ice wasn't painted white. The good news is that you'd be a lot closer to the action. A front row seat was only about 10 feet from the ice, and the rink could only hold about 2,700 fans, so nobody was that far from the action. One thing that hadn't changed is that you weren't supposed to smoke indoors at the rink. They weren't worried about the health risks. The problem was that there was no ventilation, and by the end of the game, the smoke from thousands of cigarettes and cigars would be so thick that people couldn't see the ice. After losing the first 2 games of the season, Milne brought in a couple of new players. One of them was a star lacrosse player from Cornwall named Newsy Lalonde. The Hockey News ranked Lalonde as the 32nd best player of all time. He was also named the best lacrosse player of the first half of the 20th century, so he was a pretty talented guy. These changes seemed to do the trick because Toronto won every game for the rest of the season, winning the league title with a 10-2 record. They promptly challenged the Montreal Wanderers to a one-game playoff for the Stanley Cup. Montreal was going through a warm spell, so the ice surface was covered in pools of water. By the end of the game, not only were the players drenched, but so were some of the fans watching near the ice. The game was tied 4 with 12 minutes left to play before Montreal pulled away to win 6-4. This was the closest that Toronto had ever come to winning the Stanley Cup.
Toronto was considered a favorite for the 08-09 season, but everything proceeded to go wrong. Players got hurt, players left to play for other teams, and Toronto finished in last place. As the team fell apart, fans stopped showing up for games. That's a strange feeling. Everyone knows you show up for a game even when the team is in dead last. We're Torontonians. If we only went to winning games, we wouldn't go to half the games. But this was a different time. The final blow came when the team was accused of throwing the last game of the season. Match fixing was very common in those days, and Toronto seemed to give up a soft goal whenever they took the lead. That was enough for Milne. Before the next season, he announced that the Toronto Professionals were disbanding. His motive was pretty simple. The team had lost $1,500, and that was a lot of money in those days. Milne decided to stick to showing hockey games where you didn't have to pay any of the players. Amateur hockey was still very popular in Toronto, and the best amateur teams could draw as well as the pro teams. The Allen Cup had just been created as a championship trophy for Canadian amateur hockey, and the Toronto St. Michael's Majors won the trophy a year later. All right, this is where we're going to stop today. As I was doing the research for this episode, it got longer and longer until I decided that it really had to be a two-parter. So, our next episode will talk about how Major League Hockey came to Toronto, how Toronto won its first Stanley Cup, how the players from a cup-winning team would be moved to Seattle, how the NHL was created to get rid of a troublesome Toronto team owner, and finally, how teams called the Blue Shirts, the Tecumsehs, the Ontarios, the Shamrocks, the Arenas, and the St. Patricks would eventually produce the Toronto Maple Leafs. Thanks for listening to us. If you like this podcast, please tell your friends. Please rate us online and leave comments. I don't really understand the science, but the algorithms mean that we'll show up sooner if we have more responses. If you want to follow us online, you can find us on Twitter at Toronto_history. You can find us on Facebook at Muddy York History, all one word. And we now have a Blue Sky account, which is Muddy York, all one word. Thank you for listening, and you'll get to hear the second part of the story of early Toronto hockey if you're back in 2 weeks.
Until next time.
Okay, that actually went smoothly, notwithstanding a few early hiccups.